Now that we understand permissions and how to determine whether a file is readable or is writable, we're ready to actually do the reading and writing. And the first step in doing that is learning how to access files in PHP. The PHP function that we're going to be focusing on primarily is going to be fopen. So we're going to open up a file, we're going to provide the file name, and we're going to tell it what mode it should open it in. We'll talk about modes in a second. One important thing to note is that fopen opens up a file whether it exists or not. So it will create it if necessary. Now, just because it's called open doesn't mean that the file has to exist already. We can say fopen and provide a file name that doesn't exist, and assuming we've provided the right mode to it, it will create the file if it doesn't already exist. So it will either open the existing file or it will create a new one. The same command will work for both. So now let's talk about modes. The file access modes that we have the option of passing in are R, which is read from the start of the file. This is just reading only. And the file must exist, of course, if we're going to read from it. So that's going to be reading data in from a file that's already on our server. The second two are going to be our two write methods. The first one is going to erase anything that was in the file if it already existed, or create a new file if it didn't. But we're basically going to be starting with a blank file, and we're going to be at the beginning of the file, ready to start writing. And then the third one is append or write to the end. So that's going to be useful for something like a log file, where we just need to add one new entry and then exit the file. In that case, the W method would not have been suitable because it would have truncated everything that was there before, just wiped it out. Now there's a fourth mode that I wanted to mention to you, which we won't use a lot, but it's X. And that is right from the start, and the file can't exist. So essentially what that does is keep us from accidentally overwriting another file. It says, start writing a new file, but object if this file already exists. Do not overwrite it. Now all four of these modes also offer an alternative version. Instead of just R for reading from a file, what if we want to both read and write from the file while we're in there? Well, for that we have a plus version. So for the read, we can both read and write if we put the plus after it. For the W plus, it's going to truncate us, put us at the start, but then we can go ahead and read and write from there. And append will put us at the end of the file, but also enable us to both read and write from it. And the same is true for X. So those plus versions are the ones that let us move around in the file and read a little bit, write a little bit, and then keep moving on. If we're just going to be reading though, just going to be writing, we'll want to stick with the non-plus versions. Now before we actually put fopen into practice, there's one more thing that I want to make sure I caution you about, which is file line endings. There's another difference between the two platforms, Windows and then Mac, Linux, and Unix, is the kind of line endings that end each line of a file. Windows uses /r/n. Now you may say, well, I've never seen that in a file. A lot of times they get suppressed and hidden by your word processor or whatever you're looking at, but that's how it knows to wrap around, is that it has those characters in there, and then it just hides them from you and just goes ahead and moves to a new line. Well, Mac, Linux, and Unix use /n instead. So you can see how if we're reading in a file that has the wrong line endings, it might cause problems depending on which platform we're on. So there's an additional mode modifier that we can pass in as well as the R, the W, and the A, and the X. And that is either T or B. Now B is binary mode, which says basically don't translate. Just take what I give you and write it to the file without making any changes. And B has been the default on all platforms since PHP 4.3.2. Before that, it depends on exactly which platform you were on, which version of PHP. You couldn't really be sure, but for a while now it's been standardized on B. Now T is really for use by Windows users. If you need to use Windows line endings when you're writing a file, so that let's say another Windows application can open it up later, you'll want to use the T modifier. And that will then make sure that everywhere you've said /n in your PHP script, it will quietly just put down /r/n for you so that it's ready for your Windows application. Now the same thing, if a file was created originally in a Windows application, you can use T to translate and make sure you get those correct line endings. So I just want to make sure that I at least tell you about that so that if you're having problems on Windows with having the wrong line endings, you'll know what the solution is. Now let's get some experience using fopen. So I'm going to open up TextMate and let's create a new file, and I'm going to save it in my B2B sandbox as file access.php. In this file, we're just going to concentrate on getting access worked out. So we already talked about the fact that it was going to be fopen that we would be using. So let's specify the file name, and let's just call it filetest.txt. Just a nice simple name. So then we're going to want to pass that file name in to fopen. Then we're going to need to pass in the modifier. So in this case, we're going to create a new file called file test and write to it. So I'm going to use W. If I'd used R, it would fail because file test doesn't exist. But here's also where I could pass in a B or a T if I wanted to add those additional modifiers, or a plus. But for now, I'm just going to be using the W. And fopen also returns a handle as a value. Now, you remember we talked about handles with the database connections. When we did a database connection to MySQL, it returned a handle. And the reason why that handle was useful was because then we could close it. And that's exactly what we're going to do here as well. We're going to close our file by referencing its handle. So that's just a reference to the file that we've opened so that we can continue to talk about it after it's open. Now, it's a good practice to always close your files. PHP will close all files at the end of the code execution on its own, just like it closes the database connections. But you want to close them yourself so that you don't accidentally write to the file again when you don't mean to. It's just good practice. If you're opening up the file, let's go ahead and close it when we're done. If we need to reopen it, we can reopen it, and so on. So let's go ahead and try this, and it's going to give us some problems, but they'll illustrate a couple of points that I want to make. So I'm just going to save file access, and I'll open up Firefox, and we'll go to localhost B2B sandbox, and it'll be file access.php that will load up. Now, instead of working, it gave us an error saying that fopen failed to open stream. That means it failed to open the file. The stream is just the data stream where it's going to write to the file. So the permission was denied is the error. Why? And so therefore fclose couldn't work because it had an invalid resource because we never opened it up. So this raises one issue that I want to jump to right away, which is that it's always a good idea, I think, to bracket this inside if statements. So we say if the handle succeeds, then what do we want to do? And in this case, we'll just simply close it. That's all we want to do. If not, then we'll just have something like echo could not open file for writing. So I think that's a really good habit to be in because it's going to prevent some of what happened here. Now if I do it, say I could not open file for writing, I get something that's a little more meaningful. Now I'm still getting my errors because I'm in development mode and I told my PHP file to show that to me. But in production, I would still be able to see something like could not open file for writing. And we could also take a different action here if we wanted to. But now let's deal with this permissions issue and actually fix what's going on here where it says permission denied. Now, if it did work for you, then that's great. But if it didn't, like for me, and I'm guessing it probably didn't, you'll need to go to your terminal, and into that B2B sandbox file, we need to see what the permissions are for the directory that we're trying to create this file in. We talked about permissions. So I'm going to scroll up here at the top. This is the current directory we're in. It's the period. ... is the directory one back from here. Period is this directory that I'm in right now, B2B sandbox. These are its permissions. So you can see that as a user, Kevin, I have the ability to read and write files to it. But the web server, which is not running as Kevin, it's running as www, does not have enough privileges to write. It can only read from these files. So we need to give it privileges on this directory so that it can do that. And you remember how to do that. I don't think I need to tell you, but we'll do it together. Sudo chmod, and we'll go ahead and just make it 777, so it'll open it wide up. Now you also could change the owner if you wanted. I'm just going to open it wide up so that this directory now is fully able to be read and written to or executed anything that's in it. And the way I talk about this directory is I could either navigate back a directory and then say, okay, the B2B sandbox file, or I can just use that period, and that'll say this directory that I'm in right now. And it wants my password because I did a sudo. And then let's just do ls-la one more time. We'll take a look back up here, and sure enough, this directory now has rwx, rwx, rwx. So now it is a writable directory. Let's switch back and let's just try our file access again. And there it is. It worked fine. If we come back over here and take a look, we should have gotten filetest.txt, and there it is. It created it. So it's important, I think, to use that if-then statement. It's important to always close your files. And you want to make sure that any file that you're going to try and write to is going to be writable. You just need to make sure that the file itself is readable. But in the case of writing, we need to make sure that the directory we're going to write to has permission to write to it. In the next movie, we'll take a look at how we can actually write content into the file test.